Hello, friends. My name is Eric Cloward, and welcome to the Stoic Coffee Break. The Stoic Coffee Break is a weekly podcast where I take aspects of Stoicism and do my best to break them down to the most important points. I pull from modern and ancient wisdom, psychology, neuroscience, anything that I can get my hands on to help you think better, because I believe when you think better, you can live better. This week's episode is another interview with Donald Robertson. He's one of my favorite guests on here. This will be his third appearance. And last time we were together, I was still living in Amsterdam at that time, and now I'm back here in Portland. And we had a great discussion about one of my favorite books by him called How to Think Like Socrates. He's the author of, I think, 10 books now?
I don't know, 9. I think it's 9.
9 books, 9 books, including How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, also a graphic novel about Marcus Aurelius' life. Kind of runs the spectrum. And he's also a CBT therapist, and he posts most of his stuff on Substack. So we'll make sure that we put a link in here. So if you want to follow Donald Robertson on Substack, I think it's Stoicism, Philosophy as a Way of Life is the name of your Substack.
Right.
And yeah, so today we are going to be talking about something that influences all of us, and that is anger. So anger is something that is one of our primal emotions. And so we're going to be kind of jumping into this and seeing if we can, dissect it and have an interesting conversation about anger. So, Donald, starting off, I guess, what is your perspective on anger? And I know that you've been doing a course on anger and talking about that a lot. And I know that anger is just very complex, and how it relates to in our society. For example, there's the idea of like righteous anger. You know, people feel like if they give up their anger, it's going to take the fire out of doing the things that they want to do. But the Stoics teach a lot about how anger is probably one of the most destructive emotions that we have. So let's kind of jump into that and talk about some of the paradoxes of anger, maybe where anger comes from, kind of wherever you want to start with that.
It is quite a big subject. Like most things, there's complex aspects, and then there's maybe aspects of it that are simpler. I think it's a very important subject to talk about because it's the forgotten emotion in some ways in psychotherapy. There's far less research on anger than there is on depression and anxiety, for example. And also, anger is an externalizing emotion. So when we're angry, one of the key features of it, if we're angry with other people, we typically attribute blame to them. So if I'm really angry, I'm going to think it's you guys that need to go and have therapy, like sort yourselves out, not me, right? So people who primarily have anger don't tend to self-refer for treatment. Although where you often see them is in prisons, in schools, and in the military, because in institutions, they're often referred by other people. Someone else says, hey, buddy, you need to go and see somebody about your anger, right? So there's something about it that makes angry people therapy dodgers, if you like, right? Except, for example, in a relationship or something like that, they tend to be told that they need to go and have it. So for that reason, it's kind of neglected, and particularly, I would say we live in a kind of self-help, self-improvement culture nowadays. People consume vast amounts of self-improvement stuff over the internet. When I was a kid, you go to the bookshop and there would be like a few self-help books. Now we're inundated with self-improvement courses, videos on YouTube, podcasts. There's more books than ever before. But angry people tend not to be addressing their anger. They tend to have a blind spot for it. So I'd say culturally, put very simply, people are working on other stuff, but they're not working on their own anger as much. And we can see on the internet how anger is manifesting. Once you take away the consequences of behavior and you let people loose on social media, and they maybe have anonymity to hide behind, people are surprised how aggressive and hostile and rude, how much trolling and bullying and stuff there is online. There's a clue there, which is that maybe people were angrier than we realized before, but they were suppressing it or masking it. And now on the internet, they can let loose what was already inside them, like to some extent. They're probably making it worse as well. But we can now see anger probably was always there, but not fully acknowledged and not really being addressed properly. And you're right, it comes in many different forms. So I think of it in some ways as the royal road to self-improvement, because for many people it's the area where there's most opportunity, most room for improvement, if only because it's often the most neglected area. And in fact, research tells us anger responds pretty well to psychological interventions. So in psychotherapy, there are some things that have a much higher success rate than others. Like treatments for phobias maybe take in 3 hours, like an animal phobia, you might have like a 90% success rate doing standard exposure therapy. Whereas clinical depression, harder to treat. It can take a dozen sessions or longer. Success rate's lower. Maybe it's like 50, 60%, something like that, typically. But anger has a pretty high success rate in a relatively short space of time with the majority of people. So it's something that we could potentially be working on, but we tend not to be that much. And again, the other reason that we might want to work on it is apart from the effect that anger has on us individually, obviously it also tends to have quite a big interpersonal impact. So it can destroy relationships. I don't think it's any coincidence that we see a lot of young guys in self-improvement communities, like I'm thinking of the manosphere and stuff like that, obviously, and they're consuming huge. They love their Jordan Peterson, they love their Andrew Tate, they're consuming all the self-improvement stuff, but often they seem to be getting angrier as a result of doing it. And they often go on and on about blaming other groups of people, like it's feminists and cultural Marxists, and anyone that doesn't agree with them's fault. So there's a lot of blaming, a lot of anger. And a lot of those guys don't have girlfriends. And a lot of them are angry because they're not in relationships. But I mean, you don't need to be, a genius. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out, maybe, buddy, your anger has something to do with the fact that you don't have a relationship, right? I think you see your anger as a consequence of that, but maybe it's also a cause. Maybe there could be a circular relationship there between the anger and the lack of satisfying relationships. Those are some of the reasons that I think it's important.
Yeah, I know for me, it definitely. So my anger and inability to work with that definitely was cause of the ending of my two major significant relationships. So my marriage and also my last long-term relationship, which was about 9 years. And it was, for me, it wasn't that I was angry at them per se. It was that my anger stemmed out of fear. So I grew up in a very traumatic childhood. So my dad was randomly angry, and it there was no real rhyme or reason for it. And so there was always this feeling of if my partner or the person who was supposed to provide love was disappointed, annoyed, frustrated, upset, then I would feel this fear. And so my reaction, rather than being, hey, I'm scared, it was, I've got to protect myself. And so I would get angry and try and convince them that they shouldn't be angry with me. Mm-hmm. And so then we get in a big fight and we would never talk about what they were upset about. And just the cycle just kept repeating over and over and over. And it took me really the last 2 years of just kind of being alone and just really diving deep into that and trying to understand that and doing a lot of writing on that. And that was where I kept, as I would think back through that, I was like, okay, the emotion I wasn't mad. Mm-hmm. Like I wasn't trying to be malicious or I wasn't mad about these things. The emotion was fear. And that was the core emotion of it. And so the anger was that protective mechanism for me. Wow. And I found that really interesting. And it took a while for me to, dig down and keep digging, keep digging, keep digging. And then finally it was like, there's the root of that.
Well, we might as well look at that, and dig into it, because I think it's something that can help a lot of people. Like we said earlier, that anger's complicated, and I said, it's what I like to call simple complicated. Like there's simple bits to it, and there's complicated bits as well. One of the simplest things that we find about anger is we, right out the gate, one of our biggest problems, I think, particularly when we're doing self-improvement or self-help, is that we're lumbered with what psychologists call a folk psychology. So we inherit a way of understanding the mind, and particularly a way of understanding emotion that's baked into the language that we use and the culture. And when it comes to emotions, and particularly perhaps when it comes to anger, our folk psychology preconceptions are most certainly wrong, and definitely not very helpful either. So we're quite handicapped right out the gate in terms of our own psychological self-awareness because we don't have good language or concepts for really understanding what's actually going on in anger. And so we usually say, hey, anger's an emotion. There's emotions like fear and sadness and stuff like that. We think of them as kind of sitting on a level playing field. But there are reasons to question that. Anger might be functionally quite distinct from things like fear and sadness and other emotions. Um, Apart from the fact that there may be different, as we mentioned earlier, maybe there's different types of anger that we'd have to distinguish from one another. So one of the reasons it might be functionally different is that psychologists have often said that anger, in most cases, maybe not in all cases, but particularly interpersonal anger of the type that we're talking about. So we could call that stereotypical anger, like when we get upset with other people in a relationship and so on. It often functions as what psychologists call a secondary emotion. So there's typically another emotion that precedes it. Now, in the ancient world, curiously, as far as I know, all ancient schools of philosophy, and they disagreed with each other about a lot of things, but all of them seem to define anger as a desire for revenge, which is a little bit different from the way that we think about it today. Now, one interesting implication of that is that if anger is a desire for revenge, it implies that something preceded it. Because you must be taking revenge for something. And so the Stoics spell that out pretty clearly. They say there's a sense of injury that precedes anger. So anger, very much in their eyes, is a secondary emotion that responds to a preceding sense of injury. And that initial emotion might be fear. It could be shame. It could be frustration, buddy, that you're responding to with anger. It comes in a few different flavors. It's like a selection box there of types of anger. But there's usually some kind of painful emotion. And then anger is a response to it. Now, that would make anger, in a sense, what we tend to refer to as a coping strategy. So anger could be viewed as a form of ego defense or a coping strategy. And that would also imply that in some ways, now obviously there are, let's come back to the folk psychology. The folk psychology of anger and other emotions we can describe very simply. It's got, I guess, two main qualities. One is that by default, we tend to think of emotions as homogeneous, right? And we usually think of them using what's come to be known as the hydraulic model. So people tend to think of anger and other emotions as like a force that wells up within them, and it can be sort of pushed down, or they can vent it and kind of get out of their system, or they can kind of channel it or redirect it into other things, like it's a build up of water pressure or something like that, right? And they're wrong, right? That isn't how it functions. But that's baked into our language and our popular understanding of it. So the first thing you might say is like, in reality, anger is more like a recipe. It's like a cake that's baked from sugar and milk, and flour and eggs. Like there's a bunch of things that get mixed together and that collectively they combine and they bake the cake of anger. And that's why there are different forms of anger. There's different recipes for anger, and anger varies cross-culturally. And actually, it's, in the ancient world, the way that Romans experienced anger is probably quite different from the way that modern day Americans experience anger. I think in some ways Americans experience anger differently from the way that British people and Canadians, and people in other first world English speaking countries experience anger. There might even be, differences regionally within the US in terms of the way that people process and experience anger. But definitely, if you look around the world, there are quite big differences between East Asian countries or indigenous societies and, first world English speaking countries like America and Canada in terms of the way they experience anger. Mediterranean countries like Greece and Italy, anger is experienced a little bit differently. So it's like a cake, and there's different recipes for it around the world. So we might want to go, okay, what are these different ingredients? Well, the first thing you'd want to do is distinguish, I think, in a familiar Stoic fashion between the bits of anger that are voluntary and under your control, and the bits of anger that are involuntary, not under your control. So when you get really angry, your heart might beat faster, and that's largely involuntary, right? You can't just kind of like make it stop by gritting your teeth. And your blood pressure might increase more with anger typically than with any other emotion. That's why it's highly correlated with cardiac problems, like quite a serious aspect of it. So anger raises your blood pressure. You might feel flushed. You might start to tremble and stuff. That's all involuntary stuff. There might be even automatic thoughts that flash into your mind when you're angry. Like if somebody walks up to you and spits in your face in the street, you're probably going to have a kind of reflex-like reaction to that. But then there's also voluntary aspects. There's what you do with your arms and legs and your mouth. Like, so what you actually say, do you actually punch the guy or not? Like, do you walk away? These things are voluntary, ultimately. They can feel like you've lost control of them, but in principle, they're voluntary behaviors. And so I'm spelling that out because one feature of anger is that we actually tend to lose sight of that. So people, when they get really angry, tend to feel and talk and think as if they've lost control temporarily. And there are probably psychological reasons for that, but it's kind of an illusion in a way, and we can regain control, like, and we can, can start to change the direction that our behavior takes when we're getting angry, I think. So one of the first things we want to do is kind of recognize that anger to some extent is voluntary and it's being used in most cases as a way of coping. Aaron T. Beck, like Tim Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy, wrote a really good book on anger. I think it's called Prisoners of Hate. And in it, Beck said that when he began studying anger, one of the things that's distinctive about Beck's approach is he got people to keep a meticulous record of their automatic thoughts and their feelings each day when they were having episodes of anger or depression or anxiety or whatever. And Beck said that initially some of his clients didn't recognize a preceding emotion like fear you mentioned earlier. They thought, I just get angry at people and events. But when he got them to carefully track and record their automatic thoughts, almost all of them began to notice that there was a preceding emotion. So it might be that in virtually all cases, there's some kind of emotion that precedes anger. Now, that has quite profound implications, actually, for the way that we understand anger, because it may be, that it's not a particularly good or healthy way of coping with the preceding emotion. It really changes a lot of the implications for how we understand the pros and cons of allowing ourselves to get angry and the consequences of doing so.
Hmm. I never thought of it as being a coping strategy, but I think that makes a lot of sense. So,
Well, here's a clue. When people are frightened, one of the correlates of that, in most cases, is it activates schemas of helplessness, as we put it. So people that have high levels of anxiety, we can rephrase this in a bunch of different ways, but often they feel temporarily helpless when their anxiety is peaking. When you get angry, it often does the opposite and makes you feel temporarily more empowered. So
yeah.
it compensates. It's a form of, you could also say, in psychology, there's a warning. Like in psychology, we have to have at least 6 different ways of describing the same thing, right? So I apologize if I'm using a little bit of jargon, but anger can also be viewed as a form of overcompensation, right? So I feel really helpless. I have to overcompensate for that potentially, so I do something that makes me feel much more powerful, right? So, often the strange thing about anger is it's compulsive as well, usually. So again, acknowledging there's some variation to this. Like when people feel angry, they often perceive themselves as being compelled. So they'll say things like, I had to punch that guy. I had no other way of getting the kids to listen to me except by yelling at them. So there's a lot of had to do this, must do this, no other way, no choice in people's descriptions of what they're experiencing when they're angry. So in a way, they're kind of disowning responsibility for their actions. Like they temporarily feel more focused and more powerful because they've narrowed down what they're going to do to like a single option, but they usually do it with excessive force in a way that tends to backfire, basically, and in a way that's not very adaptive to what's going on in their environment. They do it in an overly aggressive and forceful and rigid manner that's typical of anger. That's why tends to cause relationship problems and stuff like that. So it might be a good idea to communicate your opinions and set boundaries with your wife and your kids. But the problem is when you do it angrily, like you're doing something that could potentially be useful, but doing it in a rigid and aggressive way that will tend to make people defensive, and so it'll often backfire. Anger is the emotion of shame and regret. Like, people, like, the angrier they get, the more likely they are later to think, oh man, what an idiot I am. I wish I hadn't done that. And the angry people often look back with regret on here we're touching on something else that's integral to it. You talked about righteousness earlier. Angry people tend to feel justified, again, with some exceptions, but often they'll feel an inflated sense of justification or righteousness in what they're doing. So in the angry mode of thinking, you can be convinced that what you're doing is right. But a day later or half an hour later, you might think that was dumb. I wish I hadn't done that. And suddenly it doesn't seem righteous or justified in retrospect. It seems like maybe it was a stupid idea. So it shows how Seneca said anger is temporary madness. Like, I'll touch on, we're getting into all sorts of territory here, but one of my kind of pet peeves is there's another problem with our folk psychology, I believe, and it's linked to a theoretical debate that happened in ancient Greek philosophy between the Stoics, for example, and the other schools of philosophy. Plato said there are three parts of the mind. The famous tripartite model of the mind. He compared it to a charioteer controlling a team of two horses, and they represent appetite and spirit or anger, and the charioteer is reason. Later generations of Platonists simplified it and said those two horses, appetite and anger, really are the passions. So it's really a dichotomy between reason and the passions, like a charioteer controlling these animals. I think this metaphor is extremely misleading and potentially unhelpful. It's baked into our folk psychology, and I'll explain why. The Stoics explicitly rejected that idea, and they proposed what's called a monistic theory, or you could say a holistic theory of the mind. They thought the passions are a mode of reasoning, basically. It's something that infects the whole of consciousness rather than something that kind of happens over there and reason is observing, like two different parts of the mind in conflict. Now, I'm not pretending this is a conclusive point to make, but just as a kind of aside, we had pretty much the same debate in the 20th century because Freud adopted a tripartite model of the mind that was influenced by Plato. Freud said there's an id, ego, and superego, and your mind is fundamentally divided into these separate functions or parts or regions of the mind. He called it the structural model of the mind. Freud's own followers began to reject that because they thought it was overly kind of mechanical and sort of rigid. It didn't really match the lived experience of our emotions. And by the 1950s, there was a whole movement in psychology called the humanistic movement that explicitly was reacting against this kind of structural model of the mind and trying to regain the unity of consciousness and the lived experience, the phenomenology of the emotions. And so you've got people like Jean-Paul Sartre saying, the emotions are a mode of consciousness. They're not like, over there and reason is over there. So this idea of the charioteer trying to control it, what's missing from that, And I think the easiest way to cut to the chase here and highlight where the problem lies is it kind of implies the charioteer is like rational and he's trying to kind of control these two horses. Nobody. The charioteer is angry too. Like anger infects the whole psyche, right? The problem is runs deeper than that. Because otherwise you might think, man, when I get angry, I should be able to just kind of try and control it or rein it in. But the problem is you feel justified in your anger often at the time. It's more like trying to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps because your brain is already thinking in an angry way. Like, so to talk yourself out of anger when you're already thinking angrily is kind of tricky. Like, it's harder than it seems at first. I think that's why people are kind of puzzled, why they're struggling to control their anger, because they have this image in their mind that the rational part of them should be able to control the angry part, like this charioteer. Jonathan Haidt describes it as like an elephant rider trying to control the elephant. But the problem with all of these metaphors is that the elephant rider, the charioteer himself, is angry, right? And that's what the Stoics really wanted to emphasize. The whole psyche, the whole of consciousness becomes infected by anger, potentially. And so it is possible that you can get yourself out of this hole, but it's a little bit trickier than that metaphor might imply at first. And also the change, the temporal change, is more significant than it might seem at first. The fact that you can look back on it afterwards and think, I was kind of out of my mind. Like, yeah, what was I thinking? Like, when I lashed out. People end up in prison that way, and then they've got years to sit in a little room and contemplate, what was I thinking? So, the problem is more nuanced and runs a little bit deeper than that metaphor implies. Again, the folk psychology is letting us down. We need a more accurate, more nuanced understanding of what we mean when we use the word anger, unfortunately. And having a clearer understanding would give us more control. Knowledge is power. Like if we were a little bit more insight into what's going on with anger, we would be able to do more about it. But what you said about fear preceding it, that very fact, like, allows us. I said I'd highlight what I think is simple here, and that is many people benefit just from the following advice that you could write on the back of a business card, right? Spot the early warning signs of anger. Learn to notice situations, triggers that typically make you angry. So, and then be self-aware and spot the initial signs of your emotional response as early as you can, and notice the preceding emotion and then just sit with it for longer than normal, even if it was only 10 seconds. Like, just allow yourself to accept the fear, experience it, be aware of it. Because although anxiety and fear can take a lot of work in therapy, sometimes we're anxious, we're frightened, and in most cases, we're naturally able to process it. I put it to you that because anger maybe is a crappy emotional coping strategy, it might actually just be getting in the way and preventing you from doing something about the preceding emotion. And maybe you're perfectly capable, like, of dealing with the anxiety or fear, more so than you realize. But allowing yourself to get angry as a way of responding is actually sabotaging your own emotional coping skills. So just accept the feeling, sit with it for
No,
a little bit longer than normal. Is that alone is enough to benefit a lot of people.
yeah, exactly. And as you were describing it, I can 100% relate to it. So with my last partner, I would get angry and, start acting in anger. And I felt like I was completely out of control. Like I would try to do this, and sometimes I'd de-escalate a little bit, and then she would say something, and then boom, it would be right back up again. And it was just, and then afterwards I look back and I'm like, why couldn't I just stop myself? That rationality that I have. I mean, I've been studying Stoics. At this point, I've been studying Stoicism for 5 or 6 years. And I was like, I know these things, but I'm still out of control. And it wasn't like I said, until I was able to identify that preceding emotion, that core emotion, which was fear, that I felt like I was actually able to make some progress on it.
Then you might be able to do something.
A lot of that. Yeah. And fear is something that I could do something about. I could, like you said, sit with that. But it took I mean, unfortunately, the relationship was ended when I finally made some of these discoveries. But for me, I look back on it now and I'm like, okay, if I had been able to, you know, understand what the root cause of this was before and take care of that root cause, it would have been so much easier to do that. And so understanding that root cause definitely has allowed me going forward to be a lot less angry about a lot of things because I try to go to, okay, what is it that I'm feeling rather than, responding. Like a guy ripped me off for an apartment in Amsterdam, 5,000 euros. And I didn't really get that angry about it because I recognized that I'd made some bad choices and I could be very rational about that
Mhm.
and recognize that me getting angry about it was just going to put myself in a bad mood for a few days. And so why would I choose to do that?
Yeah.
I was annoyed, I was frustrated, I was disappointed, all of these things. And so I just sat in that. I was just like, God, that was really stupid. Um,
Well,
and so I find that I'm much better able to deal with anger because I've worked on dealing with the root causes first rather than just trying to stop the behavior in the moment. And now that you've kind of had that insight of anger is just a very poor coping mechanism, that makes a lot more sense. And it kind of once brings me back to I did an episode a few weeks ago talking about masculinity, and one of the things that I noticed after my divorce was that I took some time because I was like, okay, my definition of masculinity is really kind of messed up because the masculinity that was modeled to me from my father was angry. So to me, masculinity and anger were basic, and violence they were equal. And so for me, I didn't want that. And so I'm like, I have to figure out my own definition of masculinity because this isn't working. And as I was noticing things, one of the things that I noticed about myself and plenty of other men was that the only emotions that we seemed allowed to display in public are we can be happy, we can be laughing about things, we can, or at least be good,
mhm.
you know, that we're in a good mood, if you will. We could be okay, we're just, everything's fine, not a big deal, or we could be angry. Those were the only three emotions that men were really
Well,
allowed to show. And so all the negative emotions just kind of got swept up into anger. Because if you
yeah,
say, I'm really sad, or I'm grieving, or I'm scared, I'm hurting, all of these things, all the responses are, well, it could be worse, or I'll give you something to cry about, or,
well,
or you're just a coward. I mean, the fact you're crying about
yeah,
this, that means you're, and so all of these negative things about men expressing any kind of negative emotions. The only one that's acceptable is anger
anger.
because it's powerful, because it seems like you're taking control. It seems like you're
Yeah,
doing something.
yeah. It's so basically what you're saying is that if you express other emotions, it makes you weak in the eyes
Yeah.
of many people. People say you hear a lot nowadays in the culture wars sort of stuff that there's no such thing as toxic masculinity. People like to say, well, whatever, let's forget about that term and just say men are taught a lot of crappy and stupid and unhelpful things about processing emotion. And maybe we could all agree about that, right? Even if we don't call it toxic masculinity, which is the term that it was originally used to describe it. But for sure, men are taught a lot of crappy emotional coping strategies. They don't have. We just talked about all these crappy ideas that we have in our folk psychology that get in the way. Um, so you're right. I mean, you sound like Marcus Aurelius. I was going to say because Marcus Aurelius says we should ask ourselves what does us more harm, our anger or the thing that we're angry about. So that's very insightful. The Stoics were incredibly insightful about psychotherapy. I mean, it sounds like I'm exaggerating, but really, they genuinely were way ahead of their time. It really is incredibly impressive. So, Mark, that's so. For example, we know now that when people get angry, their capacity for consequential thinking gets impaired. So, all the research shows that people who are angry tend to behave recklessly. They underestimate risk. They behave impulsively. Sportsmen who are angry commit more fouls, like penalties. People who are angry get more injuries and are in more accidents. For example, all the research clearly shows from many different angles converging that angry people are reckless and impulsive and they don't think about the consequences of their actions clearly. So asking yourself, like the Stoics advise, like Marcus Aurelius says, what does me more harm, my anger or the thing I'm angry about, restores consequential thinking. It forces you to get back into your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that's actually capable of looking at the bigger picture and thinking. Afterwards, when you think about anger, you're thinking using your brain properly, your prefrontal cortex, and the next day you might think, man, the consequences of getting angry really sucked. But when you're in anger, you become blind to that. The sense of empowerment that you get from anger is partly because you don't think about the consequences of your actions. So you're only seeing the immediate effects of it. And so the weird thing is you're doing something that's clearly not going to work. So I like to describe angry people as being experts at achieving the opposite of what they want. They really are. Like anger's paradoxical. It has this creates this paradoxical sense of power because you only feel power because you're kidding yourself about the consequences of your actions. It's like you're saying, I can totally get these kids to listen to me by destroying my relationship with them. Like I can totally get my wife, to do what I want by getting divorced as a consequence. So anger blinds us to the wider consequences. But if we saw the consequences, we'd think, oh, I feel powerless again, because clearly anger isn't an effective strategy. But by blinding ourselves, we trick our brain into thinking we've got an effective strategy. It's a con. Psychologists call it the illusion of control, right? It's one of the weird paradoxes about the nature of anger. So you said, how is it that you feel sort of out of control of your own behavior? We feel like we've gained control of the situation, but we've lost control of our own behavior. We're acting compulsively. And then the next day we realize that we didn't really achieve control over the situation either. So at the time, let me break this down because there's some very simple things going on here. Because you go from feeling afraid, when people are afraid, they tend to focus more attention on themselves. So they see the core of the problem to a large extent as being their own vulnerability, right? Particularly in a social situation, if somebody's criticizing you or whatever, you think, oh, like maybe I'm weak, or like I've made a mistake, or I've done something wrong, or there's something about me that I'm unlovable or incompetent or something like that. So you tend to be focusing on yourself, and that hurts, right? But anger says, hang on a minute, maybe it's your fault, right? And so all of your attention gets projected out. Was one of the main characteristics of other directed anger is that our focus of attention shifts dramatically outwards, onto the perceived source of the problem. Like, so go, wait a minute, maybe it's not me that's the problem. Maybe it's you that's the problem, buddy. So I go from fear or anxiety or shame to anger. And anger is a kind of mindlessness as opposed to mindfulness. Like, so it projects our attention outwards, blames other people. It's all their fault. It does that at the cost of draining all of our self-awareness, all of our mindfulness away. Um, but when you do that, it's like you're taking your hands off the steering wheel, because when you drain self-awareness away completely and all of your attention goes over there on what's going to happen next and how I'm going to deal with this guy, like you're no longer in control of your own actions. You feel more in control of your own behavior when you're self-aware and mindful, like when you're observing what you're doing and how you're doing it, when you're aware of like whether you're raising your voice or not, the way that you're using your voice, like your facial expression, your actions, and things like that. You're more in the driving seat and in control of things. When you lose all of that self awareness, then you tend to have less control over your actions. It's one of the costs, the biggest price that we pay for allowing ourselves to get that angry about things. So, I mean, if you don't mind, completely abdicating control over your own actions, then by all means get angry, like because that's potentially the price that you're going to pay for it. Um,
Yeah.
that's also in ancient philosophy. They often talk about this idea of holding up a mirror to people that are angry. Seneca talks about this as a possible remedy for anger, like because they intuitively recognized that angry people lack self-awareness. and that's part of the dynamic. Now that feels like a great thing when you're angry, because self-awareness is making you painful, particularly if somebody insults you. Then for a split second you have a self-image, like you think about, maybe I look like an idiot to this person. How am I coming across to them? So you have a painful sense of your social self-image. Like you get anxious or afraid about how you come across, how you look to other people in some situations, especially if you feel shame. Shame is all about a painful sense of your self-image. Now, how could you cure that? Well, a good cure for it would be if you distracted yourself from it, like, and shunted all of your attention outwards. And how can you do that? By attributing all of the blame for the situation to the other person. Like, so training your brain, like, to focus completely outwards so that you don't pay any attention to the sense of shame or the anxiety that's troubling you anymore. It's a band-aid. Anger, it might seem odd to say this, but now I can legitimately say anger is a distraction technique. It's an emotional coping
Yeah.
strategy that often takes the form of distraction. It's like a band-aid. And you said earlier about this idea in society that anger makes people tough. This might sound odd as well, but Marcus Aurelius explicitly talks about that. In Meditations 11:18, he talks about the concept of manliness. Not kidding. Like, he talks about, this concept. And he says that some people in Roman society think that anger is manly, but he thinks the opposite is true. Like, and kindness is more manly than anger. Actually, he says anger is a form of weakness, right? It's the opposite of the way that it's presented to people. Angry people are weak ass individuals, like, abdicating control of their own behavior. You want to put it another way, people who are prone to anger, apart from the fact that at high levels of state anger, they might shave up to 10 years off their life expectancy. So how's that for resilience, right? But they tend to have poorer relationships. They have poorer mental health outcomes. Angry people are emotionally fragile, not just because we want to label them like that. I mean, in terms of the actual consequences, like, the forecast for them over time is that they have increased emotional fragility. That's the opposite of emotional resilience, right? It's the opposite of being tough. So we're taught that anger makes you tough. How can that be true? Like, all the evidence suggests that the opposite is true.
Yeah. Agreed. I think for me, one of the things that helped me to diffuse a lot of that anger was to, like I said, to deal with those root things. And part of that was also just accepting those things that we might feel insecure about, feel ashamed about, and just owning them. I think it really comes down to that self-awareness. So one exercise that I do with some of my coaching clients and even with some of my friends is I'm like, sit down and write everything you don't like about yourself. Mm-hmm. And at first they look at me like terrified, like, oh my gosh, I can't do that. And I'm like, no, trust me. It's incredibly powerful. And then do that. And then just look at each thing on there and say, can I accept this about myself? Mm-hmm. One, because it's either true, or two, you believe it's true. Mm-hmm. So this is just purely just the facts, objective acceptance of yourself. And I did this exercise a few years ago. It was just an idea that I came up with because the path that I went down is like, why do I get angry? Because I need other people's approval. I need to feel safe. Well, why do I need other people's approval? Well, because I don't think I'm a good person, so I need them to think I'm okay. So why am I not a good person? That's interesting. I don't know. What is it that's so bad about me? And so I sat down, I wrote down a list. And I looked at everything and I'm like, that's it? There's nothing on here that's all that bad. I mean, if my friend handed me this list, I'd be like, yeah, I still would accept that. I'd still love you anyway. In fact, I do the same thing, And it was just that for me was a huge turning point. And so I think that we become more resilient by dealing with those core issues. And you can only get to those core issues of self-awareness by practicing that self-awareness and just accepting all of those things, accepting that you feel sad, accepting that you feel grief, accepting that maybe you don't like this other thing about you. And so it kind of reminds me of one of my favorite lines in Game of Thrones, where Tyrion is talking to Jon Snow and he says, you know, he's like, take, you're a bastard. And he's like, yeah, what do you know of that? He's like, all dwarves are bastards to their fathers. And he's like, take the fact that you're a bastard and use it as a shield, because if you don't, everybody else will use that against you. Wear it proudly and own it because it's who you are. And it was just like, ooh, I'm kind of butchering the line, but it was just such this powerful moment of just saying, this is how they see you. So don't try and hide from it. Own it. Yep, I'm Jon Snow the bastard. And I was just like, wow, if we could just do that with ourselves more often, of just saying, yep, this is exactly who I am. And yeah, I suck at this thing and I do this dumb thing and but I'm okay with that. And I just accept that that's part of who I am.
Yeah.
Then there's a lot less to be angry about. If somebody says, hey, will you do this? And you go, yeah. Then they go, oh, well, you do that. And you go, yes, I do. Then you don't get upset about it because there's nothing to be upset about.
What you're describing is what therapists sometimes call conditional self-esteem, right? And I agree that it's at the root of most stereotypical anger. The research shows one of the questions that people have asked about anger is whether people that are anger prone, have high self-esteem or low self-esteem. And the answer seems to be that they have unstable self-esteem because it's conditional, on other people's perception of them usually. So if other people are praising you, your self-esteem will be really sky high, and you're desperately trying to cling on to high levels of self-esteem, if you're prone to anger. But actually, your self-esteem feels very fragile and vulnerable, and it's easily undermined by other people's criticism. You're sensitive to criticism if you're anger prone. And, in REBT, rational emotive behavior therapy, is the type of CBT. It's the earliest, it was the first type of modern CBT. And it's the type that's most explicitly indebted to Stoicism. The guy that founded it, Albert Ellis, as his career went on, he increasingly came to the conclusion that to really develop emotional resilience and good mental health, we need to develop unconditional self-acceptance and accept our fallibility, and also accept the fallibility and imperfection of other people. We once we accept ourselves for who we are, warts and all, then we take away the power that other people have over us. The strange thing when people get angry because somebody else has disrespected them or hasn't treated them in the way that they want to be treated, as Epictetus said, if your self-esteem is something as fundamental as your self-esteem is conditional on other people, you're enslaving yourselves to them. Epictetus says you would be ashamed to hand over your body to be enslaved by other people, but you hand over your mind, you hand over your self-esteem, he could have said, to other people, which is even crazier. Why would you do that? If you can if you can
it's
accept
called
yourself,
self-esteem.
yeah, if you can accept yourself in the way that you're describing, you potentially liberate yourself from a lot of that anxiety, shame, and anger. You're always going to be enslaved as long as you make your self-esteem fundamentally conditional on what other people think of you. And a lot of the time, because you can't read their minds, you'll be wrong about what they're thinking about you anyway. So not only are you enslaved to other people's opinions, half the time you're going to be wrong about what they're thinking or what their intentions are anyway. It really is a recipe for neurosis, basically. And then getting angry compounds it because now you're coping maladaptively with the core problem, making it even worse. And yet these self-improvement communities that you see online, are full of angry young men, who are using, they're supposed to be doing self-improvement, but they're using anger and blaming other people as a way of coping with their problems. Everything about that is clearly back to front. It's going to make them worse rather than better, basically. So I was going to mention a little bit about some of the things you've said sound like Marcus Aurelius. There are many cool things that Marcus Aurelius says about anger. But one of the other things he says is if you take away the injury, then the anger will go away, which is exactly what you're talking about. It's mind blowing. They had this idea of anger as a secondary emotion. They clearly understood it, way ahead of their time in that regard. And also Chrysippus. The Stoics, I want to say almost that the Stoics invented psychotherapy. right? That would be stretching things a little bit, but only because other people were writing about therapy. But in a sense, they did. I think the Stoics developed the first, fully fledged cognitive model of psychotherapy. Many people may think that Freud invented psychotherapy. That's wrong on many levels. Freud actually trained in psychotherapy at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris under Charcot, and also in a place called Nancy in France under Hippolyte Bernheim. It was Hippolyte Bernheim that coined the word psychotherapy. Modern psychotherapy was around for half a century before Freud. It was the hypnotists, Liabo, Bernheim, Charcot, James Braid, that invented psychotherapy, not Freud. But psychotherapy existed in the ancient world explicitly. You know, um, it's always been a thing. The novel didn't exist. There are many things that we take for granted that didn't exist in the ancient world, but psychotherapy existed in the ancient world. So Chrysippus wrote what was at the time a widely read and well known, highly regarded book called Peripathon, means on the passions. Zeno had written a similar book. Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoa, wrote this highly influential book about psychopathology. And it was 4 volumes, and the fourth volume was called To Therapeuticon, like the therapeutics. It's a book on psychotherapy. So he wrote this 4 volume thing on a cognitive model of psychopathology and psychotherapy. And Galen, Marcus Aurelius's physician, was influenced by the Stoic writings on therapy, although he was also critical of them. And he wrote a book on the diagnosis and cure of the soul's passions, which again is clearly a book on psychopathology and psychotherapy. So we have this psychotherapy. The Therapeuticon is lost. We only have fragments from it. But we have an entire book by Seneca that survives today called On Anger, on Stoic psychotherapy for anger. And it's no joke to say that most of the stuff that he says in it is broadly consistent with modern anger management and CBT. I mean, interestingly, it definitely doesn't sound like psychoanalysis, right? And it doesn't sound much like Jungian therapy. Like it clearly resembles CBT or kind of cognitive behavioral approaches to anger management, as we would say. I mean, that's like 2,000 years ahead of the game. It's crazy. Chrysippus, to 2,300 years, like or more, like ahead of the game. It's remarkable. But one of the things that you said that reminded me of that is in Chrysippus's approach. He said that when people are in the grip of a passion such as anger, they're no longer their normal selves. So again, this is part of his idea. Like it's not just like the rider on the horse trying to control. It's okay, guys, I'm fine, but I'm just temporarily out of control of these horses. I'm just kind of like, I'm fine here, but I'm just struggling to control my anger right now. No, the rider is angry. Like the whole of your psyche becomes invested in anger. It permeates like your executive function, like what the Stoics call the hegemonikon, like the master faculty, the ruling faculty of the mind. It gets to the very core of consciousness when you're angry. And so Chrysippus said that's why people say I wasn't my usual self. Like, I turned into a caricature of myself temporarily. It's temporary madness. I became different when I was angry. I wasn't thinking straight, right? And I mean, we say these things, but really understanding the implications of that. I mean, the simplest strategy. There are many things that you could do for anger, and we've touched on some already. But I'm a big believer in the postponement strategy. So it doesn't solve every problem, but generally, if you were drunk and you wanted, I've just drank a bottle of whiskey, Donald. I think it's a good time to talk to my wife about an argument that we had earlier. I would say, Eric, you might want to wait until you've sobered up, right? That would be my advice to you. Right? Here's a simple therapeutic strategy. It's based on cutting edge research in the field of psychopathology. My advice to you would be sober up, like, and then speak to your wife. Well, anger is like being drunk. You're drunk. Why would you drink a bottle of whiskey and then think it's a good idea to talk to my kids right now? Like, why, in the throes of anger, would you think this is a good time to sit and have a family meeting, right? You might think, I should probably wait until I've regained my senses, right? Because the charioteer is drunk. Charioteer is drunk on anger, right? So wait until you've recovered your perspective and composure. And then when you're using your prefrontal cortex properly again, it's become more dominant. Like you can think about the bigger picture, you can act with more self-awareness, communicate more effectively. Like so wait until you're not angry anymore. That was the most common strategy in the ancient world that they recommend, although there are many other things that people could potentially do as well. There's something I'm interested in at the moment, and it is recognized in modern therapy, and increasingly so over the focus has shifted more onto it. And it's another, I'll highlight it because it's an obscure part of Stoicism, but it's another area in which I think the Stoics were ahead of their time, remarkably so. So Chrysippus, in that book, in the Therapeuticon, he says something that's maybe implicit in the other Stoic writings, but isn't. It's often the case. It's not really spelled out very clearly. Chrysippus probably made this innovation himself, and he said that in the passions there are basically two judgments at play. Now Seneca repeats this in On Anger. So, centuries later, this seems to still be part of Stoicism. Like it's not, so it stuck with them, and they did employ it in other contexts. So Chrysippus said there's two judgments that cause the passion. And the first one has to do with the thing that's happened to you being really bad, or in the case of like an urge or a desire, it would be that it's really good. So let's bracket that off for now. But the Stoics are actually more interested in irrational desires than modern psychotherapists are. But it's either that something's really intrinsically good or intrinsically bad. So say it's something that's really bad, like somebody just insulted me, and that's awful. I can't. It's catastrophic. It's like really, really bad. So the Stoics think there's something faulty about this. Obviously, they don't believe that any external event is intrinsically, objectively bad. They think virtue is the only true good and vice is the only true evil. And we're duping ourselves when we place intrinsic value on any external event like that. External events might be helpful or unhelpful, perhaps greatly so, but they're not intrinsically evil or catastrophic in the way that we typically judge them to be when we get highly emotional about them. So this is kind of familiar. Like Epictetus says, it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. It's kind of implicit in that, right? But Chrysippus says there's another judgment that supervenes on that, and it's about what it's appropriate to do, right? And he says it's an excessive judgment. So I'm not sure about this. It's hard to disentangle, partly because of problems of translation from Greek, but I think he's implying that it's modal necessity. So the second judgment is about having to do something, like in a passion, because passions are excessive and compulsive in Stoicism, and it's about the appropriateness of a particular. The word in Greek is ambiguous. It can mean that you think something is fitting or appropriate, or that you think it's a duty or obligation that you have to fulfill. And I'm pretty sure, I know Richard Sarabji in his analysis of Stoic theories of passions, he concludes that they're talking about necessity. And that's important because it would be very preemptive of modern cognitive models of emotion. Right? It would be very similar to REBT in particular. So Chrysippus says there's a second belief. There's the first thing that we're responding to, and then there's another belief that has to do with how we should respond. How long it's appropriate to continue grieving, ruminating about something, whether it's appropriate to take revenge or get payback against somebody, whether it's appropriate to flee from a situation, or coping, basically. Now, this is way ahead of the game because it clearly resembles. In the 1960s, there was a guy called Richard Lazarus, who's one of the leading researchers on stress, and he proposed something called the transactional model of stress. And it's based on the idea that stress is caused by two appraisals, an appraisal of threat and an appraisal of our coping ability. right? And the two things interact with each other, right? And that model is the basis of most CBT models of anxiety and other issues as well. So the Stoics potentially say something that's remarkably similar to one of the leading modern cognitive models of stress, basically. And but Chrysippus says something else that I'm very intrigued by, and there's some evidence to substantiate this as well. So he, first of all, he seems to think that the second appraisal, he implies that I think that it's mainly a matter of emotional coping. And, how am I going to deal with this feeling that's emerging? Like this initial propatheia, like the initial first movement. Um, my response, I don't like this very much. So what am I going to do about that? Well, I'm going to take revenge against this guy. That'll make me feel better. Or maybe I'll just sit and ruminate about it. Or maybe I'll get the hell out of here. But these are all emotional. They're all forms of experiential avoidance, as we put it today. They're all attempts to get rid of the initial flash of emotion, basically. And so Chrysippus says that when somebody is upset, they're out of their mind temporarily, they're not their normal self. He said, Stoicism can challenge our judgments about what's good or bad preemptively in a form of preventative therapy or resilience building. But when someone's in the throes of an emotion, it's difficult to do that, he thinks. And he says of the two judgments, it's more effective to challenge the second one during an episode of anger, right? So that would be the judgment about how it's appropriate to cope. And that's very interesting. I don't know that we can be sure that that's definitely correct, but there's some evidence today that would support that, I think. It's well known that those two types of appraisal, we call them primary and secondary appraisal, function differently. The secondary appraisal uses more is slower. It tends to happen after a slight delay. It's more amenable to conscious reasoning. The primary appraisal is often very automatic, very rapid. It's more influenced by subcortical regions of the brain, so it can be harder to control. So there are some interesting psychological reasons, neuropsychological reasons, some clinical research as well that suggests he may have been onto something there, like 2,300 years ago, like which is really incredible. There's something else I'd highlight about what the Stoics say about anger. These Some of the beliefs that he targets, the main beliefs he seems to target, have to do are beliefs about how it's appropriate to respond to the emotion. So he talks about how long it's appropriate to grieve for. He could also apply that to anger and say how long it's appropriate to ruminate about anger. When we're angry with people, um, I should perhaps say this. I'll go off at a tangent for a moment. I'm not a huge fan of Nietzsche, but in the genealogy of morals, he does say something about anger, which is kind of a just so story. I think it's quite problematic as an analysis of society, which is how he intends it. A bit of a simplification, but he's on to something, I think. So Nietzsche thinks that in the ancient world, people expressed anger more directly through physical aggression and violence. And then you get the laws, criminal justice system, policing, and gradually democracy, as society evolves, we have to suppress our anger. Because in the ancient world, if somebody stole your chicken, you just go after them. Like you'd maybe get a couple of your brothers or whatever in some clubs and go and beat the bejesus out of them for stealing your chickens. Whereas gradually over time, even in the ancient world, but increasingly, following the Industrial Revolution, the spread of democracy and so on, you can't just go after somebody with a club. like beat them up because they stole your chickens. You have to go and file a complaint with the police, and wait for the wheels of justice to turn and things like that. And so Nietzsche's analysis was that people have to suppress and internalize their anger, and that causes them to be filled with resentment, and it leads them to express anger passive aggressively, like or through fantasies of revenge, and there's definitely some truth in that. Like I was saying, the internet shows that people have this anger that they're kind of releasing that was always there, internalized or suppressed before. Now they have a more of an outlet for it. Um, but I think it's true that anger statistically it seldom results in physical violence these days, or at least as a percentage of incidents when people are angry, the majority of the time anger is expressed verbally or indirectly, or it's internalized. And particularly women, men and women have different profiles in this regard, different cultures. There's different ways that people express anger. So women tend to internalize and ruminate about anger a lot more than men do. Men express it verbally more often, directly. In many cases in our society, it's expressed indirectly, passive aggressively. Um, so, a lot of times anger really doesn't so much lead to punching people in the face as it leads to us chewing over things, it gets internalized and it turns into kind of toxic rumination, basically. But we know that rumination is maintained by what we call metacognitions. So those are beliefs about your own thinking. A metacognition is a cognition about a cognition, second order belief about your own emotions or thinking. And so metacognitions would say things like, it's helpful to ruminate, to have revenge fantasies. Maybe it makes me feel better. Like, maybe it helps me to figure out what I'm going to do. Or another metacognition might be that I can't control my anger. Or another metacognition might be that anger is so toxic that I have to try and suppress it. Like, rather than, for example, maybe accepting the initial feeling but just not acting on it would be the alternative, maybe a healthier way of responding. So Chrysippus seems to be suggesting that the second judgment is typically, although perhaps not always, but it's typically metacognitive. Like it's a belief about whether we should cope with a problem by continuing to grieve or ruminate, like, or indulge in the passion for a prolonged period. And he's highlighting the fact that passions are at least to some extent voluntary, like more than people normally assume. So people are misled, as we said earlier, by the fact that some aspects are involuntary, like the initial kind of flash of emotion. But often, whether we continue to experience an emotion is to some extent under voluntary control. Like we can choose whether we continue to dwell on it or ruminate about it, or have an argument or replay conversations in our mind, or have revenge fantasies, for example. Those things might pop into our mind, but we don't have to continue to perpetuate them. We can choose to let go of them, basically. Like in meditation, you might be sitting meditating and a thought pops into your mind. You can't control the fact that thoughts popped into your mind. That's automatic cognition. But you can choose not to respond to it. That's voluntary cognition, right? When you're angry, you forget about that and you continue to dwell on things for much longer than is necessary. It's that maintains the anger rather than just allowing it to run its course naturally. So, if it's true that Stoic psychotherapy was highly metacognitive, to use some jargon, that would be way ahead of its time because that's only over recent decades has psychotherapy started to focus more on metacognition. And Chrysippus would be right that targeting metacognition seems to be particularly important. And it might also be something that people have more voluntary control over when they're in the grip of anger. So it might be hard for you to challenge the thing that you initially got offended with, although it is still possible, right? But it might be easier for you to target beliefs about anger itself when you're angry. Like, for example, to come back to the one we touched on earlier, when Marcus Aurelius says, anger does you more harm than the things that you're angry about, that's metacognition. Like he's asking himself to evaluate his anger itself. So it's not just a belief about the situation, right? It's a belief about his own response. It's a belief about his thinking. It's a belief about his emotion. The anger itself, he's saying, is intrinsically unhelpful. So he's using metacognition in that example. And also when Epictetus says it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. That's a belief about our opinions. It's metacognition again, right? So Stoicism, like Chrysippus' therapeuticon, would be in relation to anger, but also in relation to other emotions as well, advocating for a really what would be considered today to be quite a state of the art approach to psychotherapy.
Interesting. There was something you said back a little bit, and this kind of even back further that kind of clicked for me, and I wanted to bring it up. And it was that you talked about how the idea that this anger has been there all along. Just when we're online, you've kind of taken away some of the consequences, and so people
Yeah.
are just expressing that anger more readily or more openly, I guess. Which also kind of, if we take that same model and extrapolate it out on, like when you see these videos of these people, walking up to, somebody who's black or Mexican or something like that, and just completely, saying the most racist and hateful things that, and even knowing they're on video and they're just losing their shit, out there. I think that because of some of our political leaders who basically have modeled that that's okay and you can still be successful, you can still do whatever you want, you can just basically do whatever you want at this point. And so I think we've seen a more loosening of some of those mores that we had before, that was inappropriate. You don't just walk up to some stranger on the street and start shouting racist things at them. Or, it doesn't have to necessarily be racist. It could be misogynistic. But it would just seem like there was a loosening on a lot of the mores about what was acceptable behavior out in public. Yeah. And even as we have more cameras and that you're probably going to be filmed, or they're saying it right to the camera, these people don't care and they say it and do it anyway. Yeah. So I wonder if those two are kind of that same thing. Like they feel like there's not going to be consequences because people above them in power have done these things and there were no consequences.
It's a disinhibition of aggression, antisocial behavior you're describing, basically. So what causes a disinhibition of behavior like that? Drugs, alcohol, famously, the apparent permission that you get from authority figures in society, the anonymity and distance of the internet allow people to be disinhibited about antisocial or aggressive behavior. But the other thing would be anger itself. The very emotion of anger tends to make us feel less inhibited about expressing things. And then, like I said, because we become blind to the consequences of our actions. We think about it more afterwards. So it might be that people feel they can get away with doing things like that. But, the argument in the ancient world is that, look, we're probably never going to convince you, that it's a bad idea to do these things because you're harming other people. But let's start with the fact that you're probably harming yourself by behaving in this way. That's the argument that the Stoics would make. It's not even in your own self-interest. So you're disinhibiting an emotion which maybe was suppressed before, but it's not healthy to begin with. And that emotion itself is probably masking underlying shame or fear or frustration and preventing you from really dealing with the root cause of the problem. I'll tell you, here's a little bit of trivia for you that's maybe related to this. It's controversial. So one of the most controversial theorists in the history of psychology is a guy called Hans Eysenck. And Eysenck was involved in a very controversial research study. People have highlighted problems with it, but I still think it's interesting because of one of the things that it allegedly discovered by accident. So there was a big study done in the 1980s on CBT for anger management, and they were mainly interested in the health effects of it. for heart disease and I think possibly cancer as well. But Eysenck was very interested in political prejudice. So he also gave the participants questionnaires that measured anti-Semitism and racism and other political prejudices. And what they found by accident was that when people reduced their anger as a result of having the CBT, their political prejudices seemed to reduce as a consequence. Now, that's important because it's the opposite way round from the direction that people would typically think that the causal relationship runs. Probably circular, right? So we tend to think if somebody is really anti-Semitic or really racist, those prejudices are going to make them more prone to anger, right? Because they're blaming other people and stuff like that and scapegoating people. But what if it's also that people who are generally angry are more susceptible to blaming other people and becoming racist or prejudiced against religions, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, and so on? Might it be the case, that if we look around us and think there's extremism on the rise in our society, for example, and prejudice, could it be a consequence to some extent of the anger that people are experiencing? And there might be ways that we could deal with it politically, looking at the bad example that politicians are setting. But maybe by dealing with young men's anger at the root, they'd be less prone to that kind of extreme thinking in the first place.
Interesting. Yeah. Huh. Yeah, maybe the fact that we're just angry to begin with is the reason for hate towards other people.
Angry people like blaming people and looking for scapegoats, right? If there's a circular dynamic, the angrier you are, the more vulnerable you are to being talked into scapegoating other groups and to thinking, when you get angry, you tend to think in black and white terms. Your brain goes into a kind of an emergency mode. In that kind of emergency mode, it'll look for other people to blame. And then, politicians love that. So that you can scapegoat people. Angry people are really easy to manipulate. They're suckers, right? So they're emotionally fragile. They're also highly gullible, basically. So if you're a politician, get people angry. You can control them. All you have to do is tell them it's all these guys caused all the problems. These dudes over here, and then that gives you a tremendous amount of leverage over people. So I think we have to be very careful about the social implications, political implications of anger as an emotion. Look at the internet. I mean, it's all about rage farming. On social media, it's a huge machine for, in a sense, it's become a huge machine for propaganda and rage farming. It's enslaving the minds of a whole generation, potentially, by manipulating and exploiting their emotions. It's ironic because I think a lot of these people, the things that they're most upset about and angriest about are the very things that they're doing to themselves, right? So they don't want to, they hate the idea of being controlled by other people, but they're handing over control of their own mind, behavior, and emotions to other people by allowing them to stoke their anger. Ironically, they're doing the very thing that they're most frightened of.
Yeah, that takes a bit of self-awareness to be able to step up and actually see that. And for me, like I said, when I stumbled on Stoicism, it was just suddenly like a light had been shown on a whole area of life that I didn't understand. And, I'd read plenty of psychology books and stuff throughout the years and habits and self-help and, was always trying to find this. And for me, Stoicism was just the one thing where it clicked. It was like, that's the clearest answer that I've ever read about understanding what you can control. The views on anger were just so clear. It was like, all this other stuff was just, there were great theories, there were practices, there were ideas, but this was just rock solid, clear cut principles and ways of viewing things that I just found were so incredibly helpful. And I think that's kind of why I stuck with it. It was like, okay, this this actually works and this makes sense to me.
Well, look, we talked earlier about how I said anger is made of these different ingredients. And the first thing that we'd want to do is to say some bits are automatic or involuntary, and other bits are strategic or voluntary. So we'd want to be clear about the difference. Because the involuntary bits you're probably going to have to accept and just kind of like, wait it out and stop struggling against and trying to suppress or control those. But the voluntary parts you should take more responsibility and ownership over, basically. And I generally find people are doing the opposite. They're ignoring, neglecting, and disowning responsibility for the voluntary parts of their emotions, and instead they're trying to suppress and struggle against the involuntary parts. So like people generally have it completely back to front, right? Partly because they've got this confused idea about how emotions work in the first place. We kind of touched on something a little bit I wanted to emphasize because I guess it's a box that we have to tick. So if you believe in the hydraulic model that anger is this kind of force that wells up within you, there are several things we talked about. You might try and suppress it. That tends not to work. Like it causes what's called the paradox of thought suppression. So we know when you ask people to do that, often their feelings just kind of rebound more subsequently. There are a number of other problems with doing that as well, but basically it's not usually a good strategy. You might try and channel your anger by going and using it in the gym, or you might just kind of vent it and try and get it all out your system. You could say that generally speaking, you could understand most anger is involving some form of venting, typically. So generally, when you yell at someone and behave aggressively and stuff like that, you're kind of venting your anger. I would argue that angry people convince themselves that they're using anger as a form of problem solving. So they think that when they get angry, I had to yell at the kids because it's the only way I could get them to tidy their room or whatever. I had to slap my wife. It was the only way I could get her to listen to me or something like that, right? So they treat it as if, it's a ridiculously simplistic form of problem solving, right? It's crazy problem solving, but they treat it as if it's a form of problem solving. But there's a deeper error that they're engaged in, which is if you look closely, it, it is that they're not actually using aggression as a form of problem solving. They're duping themselves even about that. Their motivation, I think, on closer inspection, is that they're using the angry behavior not to solve the external problem. Like, because from outside you might think that it's puzzling. Slapping your wife seems like it would not help. Like shouting at the kids seems like it might backfire, right? That's because they don't care, right? That's not really why they're doing it. The real reason that they're doing it is as a form of emotional coping. Like, so their real motive is that they're using the expression of anger in an attempt to cope with the painful feelings that they're experiencing. And everything about their behavior, I think, suggests that they're deceiving themselves about their reason for engaging in that behavior, right? So, really, what they're doing is trying to deal with their pain by getting angry. It's not an attempt to try and fix something in the relationship, or to deal with an external. It would be like completely crazy attempt to do that, right? It's disguised as that. But really what's driving it is an attempt to relieve anxiety or distract yourself from it temporarily, basically. And on that front, it's not effective. What I wanted to emphasize is that venting is possibly the least effective emotional coping strategy in the history of psychotherapy research, basically. So there are many studies that show, particularly in relation to anger, that venting anger doesn't really relieve anger permanently, and it often just makes people more susceptible to it in the future. So this idea that anger kind of builds up within you as a pressure, like a pressure, and it'd be like lancing a boil or getting it out of you. So you can get your anger out, and then it's kind of gone. Rather, it's more like by expressing anger, you're reinforcing the habit of feeling angry, right? So,
So
but
you're
that,
training your physiology.
yeah. And there's another problem with it, which is if you think anger is just this kind of homogeneous energy, again, if we think of it more like a recipe, and like the Stoics, their big contribution was to say that the passions are cognitive, right? That they consist of particular beliefs and judgments. As Albert Ellis used to say, it's not just how you feel, it's also how you think. You're thinking angry as well as feeling angry. You might think, oh, that's kind of interesting, Donald. How then could it be beneficial to go and redirect your anger into working out in the gym? What's that going to do to modify the underlying attitudes and beliefs that made you prone to anger in the first place? It's going to do nothing, right? So what it'll do is temporarily get rid of some of the adrenaline like that you've built up, basically, or some of the muscular tension. But the anger doesn't just consist in those physiological symptoms or sensations. The anger consists in your sense of entitlement, like your desire for revenge, like the attitudes and beliefs like that are underlying those sensations. And going to the gym and channeling your anger is not going to get rid of those. And in fact, it might actually just maintain or reinforce them. And also, like venting your anger isn't going to do anything. Like, it will distract you from some of the uncomfortable feelings that you've got inside. So, venting might make you feel better temporarily, but it's not actually going to do anything to change the beliefs that made you prone to anger in the first place. So, again, it comes back to this fact that having a very simplistic folk psychology of anger leads us to coping strategies that are known to be ineffective. Unfortunately, the internet, and particularly the manosphere, by the way, is full of self-help influencers who give advice that's based on the hydraulic model. Like, so they're always telling people to vent their emotions or go and channel them into activity in the gym and stuff like that. That's not going to do anything to remove your irrational sense of entitlement, right? If you ask a girl out on a date and she says, no thanks, I'm not interested, like, a wise person might think, okay, fair enough. If you feel irrationally angry and offended by that, going to the gym isn't going to do anything to remove your fragility, right? You've got a bigger problem. Like you're really just distracting yourself from or putting a band-aid over by doing that. But that's the advice like that people get from crappy self-improvement and self-help, you know, channels and podcasts and things like that. The problem is that if a lot of our psychopathology is caused by maladaptive coping, we'd have to be really careful that people aren't telling us coping strategies that are of the very sort that maintain the problem in the first place. There's two types of coping. There's coping that actually helps you, and coping like that's at the core of maintaining the problem, like the crappy toxic coping. Like, you're going to get like people just reinforcing some of that crappy toxic coping that's based in the folk psychology. If you're talking to people that don't know anything about psychology or therapy or coaching or anything, like people that are ignorant of the subject, they're going to give you the same bad advice that you're giving yourself to begin with, but more of it, basically. That's what you find in the manosphere a lot of the time. Not always, maybe, but for sure, that's the kind of advice that you're getting from Andrew Tate, like, and like some of these other dudes online. So increasingly in therapy, you'll see people that have got a psychological problem, anger, or it could be some other problem, and they're doing things that they've learned off YouTube that actually is just making the problem worse, right? It's just basically, some kind of distraction or avoidance or suppression technique that they're using, like more of the same, basically. But they think that's self-improvement or self-help stuff. Like bad self-help advice can cause more problems than it solves. Here's a clue. We drink from a fire hose of self-help stuff today. Those guys in particular, like a lot of the stuff that goes on in the pretty much the whole manosphere revolves around self-improvement advice, right? Well, people consume it all day long. They have it on their phone. They could be sitting in the lavatory watching it or listening to podcasts, whatever, right? So, given that they're consuming far more self improvement content than people did 20, 30, 40 years ago, how come they're not all improved?
Yep.
Why we should
Yeah.
be able to look around and think, man, like these young guys that are on these manosphere influencers podcasts all the time, It's amazing how much they've improved. No one looks at them and thinks they all look improved by this. Like, are they getting more angry or less angry as a result of watching Jordan Peterson videos? I'll let you decide.
Yeah.
I don't think they're getting
Yeah,
less
I think
angry.
yeah, I think that it does create a feeding cycle like that. And it's more that yeah, because they're not dealing with the root causes, because the root causes are painful to deal with.
That's
And
right.
they take self-reflection and self-awareness. And, that's something that I had to do. Because I'm like, why am I always angry? Okay, let's dig a bit deeper than just trying to control it. Let's look at the root causes of it. And that was a huge shift for me. And now I find that my overall mood is definitely much more upbeat and much more relaxed. And you know, I don't really get that angry or frustrated at things anymore like I used to. I mean, occasionally I do, and then it's like, okay, I see what I'm being frustrated with. I can't quite get rid of this emotion. Let me go do something else, and then come back, and then I can think through it and be a little bit better off.
That's because you're becoming wise in your old
I hope
age.
so.
That's what happens. So we become
Yeah.
wise. We get wise and then we die. Just like
Well, I mean, some people
in
don't. I
our
know plenty of people
in our
who
twilight
get old and
years.
don't get wise.
I was very angry when I was a young guy. And I think actually that ironically, one of the things that sometimes happens with anger, maybe more than other emotions, is that people reach a point where they suddenly think, this is too much. It's gone on too
Yeah,
long. And they kind of have a like an awakening. Um, and it can cause them to question. The more serious a problem that someone has with anger, the more deeply they'll start to question the problem. So I had quite a lot of anger. It went on for quite a long time. In my mid 20s or something, I think I was from my teens. I was still like angry about a lot of things. And I thought, I can't go on like this. I have to do something about it. So that forced me to become more questioning than normal. Like, I had to dig into my anger a little bit more and try and understand, what was going on. But there are many things that we can do, many different therapy techniques and stuff, but you could really, and it sounds too simple. Often the most important solutions actually are very simple, but really just, you know, noticing anger, questioning it, looking more deeply into the origin of it, the root of it, that act alone, that very decision itself is potentially going to set a lot of things right. Like I say, anger is all about distraction. It's bad coping. But the good news is the minute you start to think, maybe this is wrong, maybe there's a better way, like you start to hold a mirror up, like in those ancient Greek texts, like Seneca and Plutarch talk about. The day that you start to actually hold a mirror up, just that very act of looking more deeply into yourself is fundamentally antagonistic to the whole psychology of anger. Like, anger doesn't want you to look in the mirror. Like, it needs you to smash the mirror, like trample it underfoot, like, and just get caught up in scapegoating. But the minute you pick the mirror back up again and really start to look at yourself, that's the most important step, to be honest, that you could put. There's a bunch of other therapy stuff that I'd like to recommend, obviously, like CBT stuff. I could go through a big list of different techniques, but I think really the root of it often is something more human and more fundamental. Like sometimes we don't see the wood for the trees in therapy, but the core of it really is just that ability to pause, take a look in the mirror, and that I can't emphasize enough how fundamentally that tends to interfere with the very psychology of anger itself. Slowing down as well. Anger
yeah,
speeds up our perception. Time flies when you're having fun, right? The time tends to fly when you're in the grip of anger, right? People lose track of time when they're worrying, ruminating, or angry. So you might think anything that makes time slow down is potentially going to give me more control over my anger. Do you know what research tells us slows down our perception of time? Is self-awareness. Like, the more you pay attention to proprioceptive sensations, like kinesthetic sensations, the stuff that's going on inside your body, like the more it tends to slow down your perception of time passing. And the more you shunt your attention outwards, like, and forget about yourself and focus on that guy over there because he's the problem, the more time will seem to like fly past. Before you know it, you've said or done something stupid, and then the next day you're going to have all day long to regret it, or the rest of your life to regret it, right? But catching yourself in the moment and noticing how you feel. Like here, I should talk more about some therapy techniques briefly. You can train yourself to anchor your attention more in the present moment simply by just using coping statements. So you could say to yourself, right now, I notice that I'm tensing. Right? By saying right now, you're forcing yourself to pay attention to the present moment. I notice, like you're forcing yourself to become more self-aware that I'm tensing by turning it into a verb, like rather than saying I am tense. You're forcing yourself to take more ownership over what's going on. Typically, when people are angry, they're screwing up their face, clenching their neck and shoulders, clenching their fists or whatever. Sometimes their jaw. Like, so right now I notice that I'm tensing. As soon as you do that, you might think, why the hell am I doing that? How is that helpful? And it gets you more into consequential thinking. And you might say, right now I notice that my heart's beating faster. Right now I notice a tingling in my face because my blood pressure's shot through the roof. Right? So grounding your attention in the present moment. But the other thing you can do, I won't go into a big digression about cognitive fusion. I'm kind of like tempted to. It's one of my hobby horses. But I'll just say it can be very useful as well to gain distance and observe in a detached way the angry thoughts that you have. So you might say to yourself, right now, I notice that Donald is having the thought, this guy's a total a-hole. Right? I should punch him in the face or something. I need to teach him a lesson. So right now I notice that Donald's having the thought, I should teach this guy a lesson. And that allows me to take a step to one side and observe myself almost like I'm holding the mirror up again, metaphorically. It can defuse the thoughts rather than me being compelled to act by that thought. It gives me like some delay, like it decouples the thought from my action potentially if I can get in the habit of doing that. Another thing you might say is right now I notice that I'm angering myself and turning it into a verb, right? So rather than thinking, I just am angry and I need to get rid of this anger somehow, you might think, how am I angering myself right now? Well, here's a clue. Probably through tensing all your muscles up and saying certain things to yourself. Highly evaluative, kind of rigid patterns of thinking. It's probably how you get yourself angry. I'm going to do, maybe this is a bit of an information dump, but I want to give people a little bit more content. In REBT, which is actually one of the most effective forms of CBT for treating anger, the evidence shows us. The idea in REBT is there's certain stereotypical types of belief that cause emotional problems. And so the reason REBT is very good for anger is it places a lot of emphasis on rigid demands, must, should, got to, have to, kind of in the mode of necessity. Like, so those kind of beliefs are integral to anger, right? Even if you don't say that, and angry people do say stuff like that a lot, if you're thinking, acting, and feeling as if other people damn well have to respect you, then that's a recipe for neurosis. You're probably going to get angry. You might as well, the minute you say other people have to respect me, you might as well put dot dot dot, otherwise I'm going to get angry. Right? You're pretty much just programming your brain with an algorithm. It's that simple. That says, other people have to respect me, otherwise I'm going to get angry. Well, you're bound to get angry then, because sooner or later, maybe even on a daily basis, people in some shape or form are going to disrespect you, because that's life, buddy. Get used to it, right? And they're not under your control. So these rigid demands, like other people have to respect me, and often there's also judgments that say if they don't, or if things don't go my way, it's awful or catastrophic. So I'm exaggerating how bad the consequences are. And often I'll say, otherwise, it means that they're jerks. So another typical, some people think, I'm still not 100% sure really what the cognitive kind of essence of anger is, but some people think it's the what you can call global negative ratings or labels, right? I think it's pretty integral. Some people even believe it's essential to other directed anger that we have this kind of reductionist view that we say this guy's a jerk or an idiot or incompetent or she's a bitch or he's a bastard, right? Those kind of judgments about other people. I'm not I'm not sure. Like they maybe they're virtually essential, or maybe they are like essential to at least certain common types of anger. But they're irrational because you're labeling somebody in terms of their behavior. So even if somebody's rude to you, it doesn't mean that they're fundamentally an asshole, right? Because they probably, maybe for all you know, they helped an old lady across the street earlier. Yeah, most people have done a combination of nice things and nasty things in their lives, but the minute you label their whole character, you'll have a more extreme emotional reaction to them because this kind of reductionist way of thinking. And then usually what's kind of forgotten about as well, so you've got the rigid demands that you impose on other people. You can also get angry with yourself. That's another can of worms for another day, maybe. But in stereotypical anger, it's usually other directed. You can also be angry with life or events. That tends to take more the form of frustration. But again, like that, another thing for another day, maybe. But for other directed anger, um, it's usually, you have to do what I want. You have to respect me. If you don't, it's awful. Like, if you don't, it means that you're a jerk. Maybe I'm frightened that also makes me feel like I'm worthless or unlovable or incompetent or something like that as well. If you insult me or criticize me, it's my fragility that you've activated by disrespecting me or not doing what I want. But there's another belief, which is more to come back to, it's related to what Chris Ipis said about his second judgment about coping. So usually there's what Albert Ellis calls low frustration tolerance, or I can't stand it-itis. So I can't stand it when people disrespect me. And that's very closely related, but it's kind of like the flip side of the coin. From when other people disrespect me, it's awful. That's how severely bad it is. But I may also have a belief about feeling overwhelmed or helpless in response to it. Because I might think, man, it's really awful when people are rude to me. Pretty tough guy, I can handle it. I know exactly how to deal with this. And then I wouldn't be angry or upset. But if I think it's horrible when people are rude to me, and also it's unbearable, like I can't tolerate it, I don't know how to cope, then I'll feel helpless, and then I'll probably feel compelled to overcompensate by slapping them or shouting at them or whatever, or just ruminating about it internally. So usually there's a feeling, there's this kind of this is intolerable, it's unbearable, I can't handle it, it's overwhelming, it's too much. As soon as you start to think like that, in those extreme terms, your appraisal of your own coping ability is zero, effectively, right? And that there's something deeply toxic about that. It's not surprising it leads to extreme behavior. So I think often in many cases, ironically, another way of dealing with anger is by improving people's flexibility and self-confidence in their own repertoire of coping abilities.
Yeah, I can agree with that. And I think that that's why Stoicism has been, like I said, been such a guidepost for me because it has really helped me to develop that self awareness to do that and to be able to, yeah, like I said, diving into the more of the roots of things rather than just focusing on the behavior itself because that didn't seem to be working for me. So I think we're coming up on time here. I think this is probably a good place
Wrap up.
To wrap up. Um, so before we go ahead and tell my audience where they can find out more about you online.
And Substack. I love my Substack now, I guess. Like I put all my podcasts and my articles and things out there. Like that's the best place to find me. I followed Sam Harris's advice and I deleted the Twitter app from my phone. Actually, I'd already done that. I followed my wife's advice. Like I was being interviewed by Sam Harris, and he said, apart from studying Tibetan, even though he'd studied Tibetan Buddhism, mindfulness for decades, he said the single behavior that contributed most tangibly to his overall psychological well-being was deleting Twitter from his phone. And I
Yeah,
agree. Like,
I still have an account, but I'm never on it. I still have an account on there, which when I do post social media, I post on there hoping that somebody might pay attention, but I don't go on Twitter anymore.
it really, I watched 1984 the other night. Like Twitter, I mean, social media in general is pretty bad, but Twitter seems to me to be the worst in terms of just
Yeah.
basically being a huge foghorn for political propaganda. Like, and I don't, it's clearly not a healthy thing to expose yourself to in large quantities. So
Yeah.
I definitely agree with him. Like just not having to listen to a load of propaganda all day long is, certainly healthy. I get notifications about propaganda. What? That's insane. Like, why would I want that? Like,
Yeah.
basically,
Yeah. I've noticed that. For some reason, it keeps popping up. Hey, you should listen to this person. And it's like,
no
just some of the
thanks.
most vile, ridiculous stuff. I'm
Yeah.
like, why would you think I would be interested in this? Post about Stoic philosophy, and you've got this hardcore right winger who's, just this is ridiculous. I'm like, okay. So I'm never on Twitter. It's like I
I'm
still have my
not.
account, but I'm never on it. So
I'm not selective. I think there's some nut jobs on the left as well, to be honest. But like, in either
true.
case, like, it could be. I feel I'm just suspicious. I agree with the ancient philosophers who said that politics, by its very nature, tends to corrupt people. Like, there's something. There could be the good politicians, but there's definitely something about politics that, by its very nature, tends to corrupt. It's a big challenge. The ancient Socrates
Yeah.
thought you'd have to be a heroic figure to enter into the political arena and retain your wisdom and virtue. It's possible, but it would be like the
Hmm.
almost like the sage, like the Ethiopian phoenix or something. Maybe once in a blue moon, there's somebody who can actually rise above like all of the corruption and money and stuff that swirls around in politics, and not be affected by it. But I think it's extremely difficult. Like you wouldn't last very long in politics unless you were willing to take backhanders and things like that, and to be dishonest about things. So it's like a machine for like basically manufacturing people who are it's a machine for manufacturing sophists. The opposite of Pierre Hadot said that the universe is a machine for manufacturing the Stoic sage. I think politics is kind of like the opposite, basically. So yeah, I'm not on Twitter. Basically, you can find me on Substack, which I think is a slightly better environment for writers and stuff. And yeah, sure, rush out and buy my books. Like I didn't used to say that, but I think my publisher is kind of like wishes that I would say it more often. So, Socrates, How to Think Like Socrates was my most recent book. I'm working on a book about anger, but it's going to be a long time before that comes out. But all my How to Think Like a Roman Emperor and How to Think Like Socrates have both got quite a lot of stuff in them about anger, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. I've really been enjoying. I am two-thirds the way through How to Think Like Socrates, and I need to get back to it. Like life got chaotic. I moved back from Amsterdam, had to find an apartment, all of those things. So, and then I've been working on the courses, speeches, other things. So it's like I keep looking at that because it's sitting on my shelf right over here, and I keep going, need to finish that. I've got like one third left, and I'm almost there. But really enjoy it. And every time I kind of go back, and sometimes I was working on an episode a while back, and I needed a story from it, and so I pulled from that. And I was like, okay, where was that? There's that story. So I find
Well,
it a useful reference book. So
I should say as well, I think the audiobook is much better than the. We put a lot of effort into the audiobook, and something that's quite odd about it is the kind of reviews for on Audible for the audiobook. Like on Audible, um, and Amazon, people gave How to Think Like a Roman Emperor slightly better reviews, and not only by a kind of small margin, but it came out slightly on top in terms of reviews on Amazon. But on Audible, How to Think Like Socrates rates higher. Like, so I think that's interesting. Like, I wrote it intending it primarily to be an audiobook, and so I think hopefully if people are thinking about checking it out, especially if they listen to podcasts, they might want to check out the audio version.
Nice. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.
Yeah. So there's a lot of heavy stuff to talk about that we talked about. So,
Yeah.
but anger, I think, is something that is coming to the fore in our society today, and I think it's important for us to talk about it. And because the more that we can talk about it, the more we can actually discover the roots behind it, and hopefully change our behaviors and help others change their behaviors. So, and that's the end of this week's Stoic Coffee Break. As always, be kind to yourself, be kind to others, and thanks for listening. Also, if you haven't bought my book, Stoicism 101, I would really appreciate if you would. You can find more about it on my podcast, on my website at stoic.coffee. Also, if you're not following me on social media, I know we just talked about social media, you can find me on Instagram and Threads at stoic.coffee, and YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, all the others, just Stoic Coffee, all one word. Thanks again for listening.